In a quiet cemetery nestled in a small town, a story of loyalty and grief unfolded in the most unexpected way. The cemetery was peaceful, with rows of tombstones stretching across the landscape, their silent presence speaking of lives long past. But among these gravestones, one stood out, not because of its design or the flowers adorning it, but because it was never empty. There at the foot of the grave lay a German shepherd, old and frail, his body pressed against the cold marble. His name was Rex, and he had not moved from this spot in weeks. The name on the grave read, Michael Dawson, beloved son, friend, and hero. Michael had been a firefighter, a man loved by all, and Rex was his loyal companion. Rex had spent his entire life by Michael's side, and now in death the dog refused to leave. His fur was unkempt, matted in places, and his ribs were visible beneath his coat. His once proud eyes were now filled with grief, staring at the name on the gravestone. At first, the cemetery workers thought it was just a moment of mourning, a dog grieving the loss of his owner. But as the days turned into weeks, it became clear that Rex wasn't just grieving, he was waiting. Visitors tried to help, offering food and water, but Rex would not budge. He ignored them all, his eyes never leaving the grave. The cemetery keeper, Walter Green, had seen many things during his years of service, but nothing quite like this. Every morning, as he made his rounds, he would find Rex in the exact same spot, unmoving, silent, waiting. "Can't stay here forever, buddy," Walter muttered under his breath one day as he observed the dog. But something in his gut told him that Rex wasn't just staying because he wanted to. Rex was waiting for something, or someone. Walter knew this wasn't just about grief. It was something deeper. As the days passed, Rex grew weaker. His body became frail, and the once strong, proud shepherd was now just skin and bones. But still, he wouldn't leave. Walter could see it in Rex's eyes. The dog had made a decision, and it was clear that nothing, not even hunger or exhaustion, could pull him away from that grave. Rex was more than just a dog now. He was a symbol of unwavering loyalty, and Walter could sense that this was a love that death could not break. As the days turned into weeks, Rex's condition grew worse. The once vibrant German shepherd had become a shadow of his former self. His fur had lost its luster, turning dull and dirty from the dirt and neglect. His ribs were visible beneath his thinning coat, and his eyes, once full of life, now appeared sunken and tired. But still, Rex did not move. He remained pressed against Michael Dawson's grave, waiting. Walter, the cemetery keeper, continued to watch the dog with growing concern. He had seen grief before, of course. He had witnessed mourners breaking down at the graves of their loved ones, some returning frequently to pay respects, while others couldn't bear to return at all. But he had never seen a dog mourn like this. Never had he seen such devotion, such refusal to leave. Visitors tried to help in various ways, but their efforts were in vain. One elderly woman, who often visited her husband's grave, had brought a plate of warm food to Rex, hoping he would eat. She placed it gently on the ground, just a few feet away from the dog, and whispered, "Come here, sweetheart." But Rex didn't move. He didn't even raise his head. Later, a young man had tried a different approach. He brought a leash, kneeling beside the dog and extending his hand in an attempt to coax him into leaving. But Rex barely flicked his ear, indifferent to the man's presence. As the days went by, Walter became increasingly worried. He had been the cemetery keeper for over 30 years and had seen many different kinds of grief, but never one like this. Rex wasn't just lying there in sadness. He wasn't just waiting for his owner to return. Walter was starting to believe that the dog had lost the will to live. He wasn't just mourning Michael Dawson. He was waiting for something else. Or perhaps he had given up. By the end of the third week, it was clear that Rex was fading. His body had become frail and weak, and his once vibrant spirit seemed to be slipping away. Walter crouched beside him one morning, his heart heavy with the realization that Rex might not have much time left. "You're going to die here, boy," Walter murmured quietly, his voice full of sorrow. Rex blinked slowly in response, but his eyes did not leave the grave. Walter stood there for a moment, helpless, before sighing and running a hand through his graying hair. He couldn't just stand by and watch this dog waste away. Rex had been through so much already, through fires, through danger, through loyalty that had never wavered. Walter knew he couldn't let Rex die like this, alone and abandoned. It was time to act. That night, Walter made a decision. He went home, rummaged through his cabinets, and found an old wool blanket. He packed a fresh bowl of water and some leftover steak from his fridge. It wasn't much, but it was something. He couldn't bear the thought of Rex spending another night there in that state. As the moon rose in the night sky, Walter made his way back to the cemetery. The air was cold and his breath was visible in the chill. His boots crunched softly against the damp grass as he walked to Rex's side. The dog was still there, motionless, pressed against the grave, his body trembling from the cold. Walter gently set down the bowl of water and the plate of steak a few inches away from Rex. Then he unfolded the thick wool blanket and draped it over the dog's frail body. Rex flinched but didn't resist. For the first time in weeks, Walter felt a glimmer of hope. He sat down beside the grave, pulling his coat tighter around himself to keep warm. "I know you're waiting for him, buddy," Walter said softly, his voice tinged with both sadness and compassion. "But he's not coming back." Rex didn't move, but his tired brown eyes finally shifted toward Walter. For the first time in weeks, Rex was looking at someone, not through them, but at them. And in that moment, Walter knew that Rex wasn't just holding on because of grief. It wasn't about Michael Dawson anymore. It was about letting go. But could Rex do it before it was too late? Walter wasn't sure, but he knew that the dog needed help. And if no one else was going to help him, it was up to Walter to do something. The next morning, Walter arrived at the cemetery earlier than usual. The sky was still a soft shade of gray, the crisp morning air carrying the bite of dawn. Rex was still there, but something had changed. The dog wasn't lying down in the same motionless way as before. Now he was curled into himself, his breathing slow and shallow. His frail body barely responded to the world around him. Walter knelt beside him, his heart tightening in his chest. "Come on, boy," Walter murmured, his voice full of quiet urgency. "You've got to snap out of this." But Rex didn't respond. His once vibrant eyes were now clouded with weariness. Walter gently placed a hand on the dog's side, and for the first time, Rex didn't pull away. Walter exhaled, feeling the weak rise and fall of Rex's ribs. He could feel the heaviness in the air, the weight of something inevitable. Walter had spent most of his life working at the cemetery, and in all those years, he had seen grief manifest in countless ways. People mourned their lost loved ones in different ways, but none of it ever seemed as intense or as heartbreaking as this. This wasn't just grief. This was a dog who had given up. Walter crouched beside Rex, staring at the grave of Michael Dawson. The old shepherd's loyalty was unwavering, but it was clear to Walter that Rex couldn't keep going like this forever. His body was too frail, and his spirit seemed too tired. Walter thought about the stories he had heard. Stories of dogs who refused to eat, who stayed by the graves of their owners until their own time came. Was Rex one of those dogs? Had he already decided that he couldn't live without Michael? Walter didn't know, but he knew that if someone didn't help, Rex wouldn't survive much longer. With a heavy sigh, Walter made up his mind. He needed to do something more. There was only one place where he might find help: the fire station where Michael Dawson had spent his life. Michael had been a firefighter, and it was there that Walter hoped to find someone who cared about Rex. Maybe, just maybe, they could help Rex find the strength to live again. Walter drove to the fire station, his thoughts consumed by the situation. It had been years since he had set foot in the station, but he still remembered the smell of smoke and the constant buzz of activity that used to fill the place. When he arrived, he hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to approach the firefighters. Finally, he stepped inside. A young firefighter, no older than 30, looked up from the desk. "Can I help you, sir?" he asked, his voice soft but professional. Walter cleared his throat, his voice wavering as he spoke. "I'm looking for someone who knew Michael Dawson, the firefighter." The young man's expression softened. "We all did," he said, a quiet reverence in his voice. "He was one of the best." Walter nodded, relieved that the man seemed to understand. "I need to talk to someone about his dog, Rex." The firefighter's face changed instantly. His jaw tightened and his eyes grew distant. as if he had already anticipated the conversation. "You mean Rex?" he asked softly. "We all know Rex." Walter swallowed hard. "He won't leave Michael's grave," he said. "He's been there for weeks, and if something doesn't change, he's not going to make it." The firefighter sighed, leaning back in his chair. "That dog spent his whole life here with us," he said, his voice tinged with sadness. "Michael rescued him when he was just a pup, trained him right here in the station. Rex was part of this place, part of the family." Walter's stomach twisted. He hadn't realized how deep the bond between Michael and Rex had gone. Michael had not only been a firefighter, but he had also been a father to Rex. The realization hit Walter like a punch to the gut. Rex wasn't just mourning the loss of his owner, he was mourning the loss of his entire family. Just then, another voice spoke from behind the firefighter's desk. A man in his 50s, with gray hair and a worn but dignified expression, stepped into view. "Where is he now?" the man asked, his piercing blue eyes locking onto Walter. "At the cemetery," Walter answered, his voice filled with urgency. "But if we don't do something soon, he won't last much longer." The man didn't hesitate. "We're going to get him," he said firmly. And just like that, the firefighters sprang into action. They had already known Rex was part of their family, and now they were determined to bring him back. Walter watched as the men gathered their equipment, preparing to bring Rex home. They didn't need to say much. They all understood what was at stake. As Walter left the fire station with them, he realized something. This wasn't just a dog. Rex wasn't just a loyal pet who had lost his owner. Rex was family. Michael Dawson had given everything for the people he served, and now it was time for the fire station to return the favor. They weren't just going to save Rex. They were going to give him a reason to live again. Together, the firefighters and Walter made their way back to the cemetery. They had one mission: to bring Rex home. As the fire truck rolled to a stop outside the cemetery gates, the air was thick with emotion. Walter stood by, his arms crossed, watching the scene unfold. The once strong German shepherd, who had spent weeks lying motionless at the grave, was still there, his frail body barely stirring with each shallow breath. But something had changed in Rex. His once immovable spirit seemed to waver, and for the first time, there was a slight shift in his posture, a subtle acknowledgement that he wasn't alone anymore. Captain Tom Reynolds, the firefighter who had spoken earlier, led the team with quiet determination. He, along with Jake and Louise, had trained under Michael and had come to know Rex as more than just a dog. Rex had been a hero in his own right, standing by his owner's side through thick and thin. Now it was their turn to stand by Rex. "Where is he?" Tom asked Walter, his voice steady but laced with concern. Walter pointed to the far corner of the cemetery where Rex lay on Michael's grave. The firefighters moved quickly, their boots crunching against the damp grass, the solemn weight of the moment hanging in the air. Rex was lying on his side, motionless except for the faint rise and fall of his chest. When the team approached, they didn't rush. They didn't try to pull him away immediately. Instead, they stood by, waiting for Rex to acknowledge them. "Rex," Tom called softly, his voice carrying across the quiet cemetery. The dog's ears twitched. It wasn't much, but it was a response. Tom knelt down slowly, reaching out a gentle hand to stroke Rex's head. "It's time to come home, buddy," he said softly, almost as if speaking to a beloved friend. "Michael's gone, but we're still here for you." For a long time, nothing happened. Rex didn't move. The firefighters stood around him, waiting in silence, unsure of what would happen next. Then, just as they were about to give up, something incredible happened. Rex whimpered, a sound so soft and broken it barely registered in the cool evening air. But it was enough. It was enough to prove that Rex was ready to let go. With great care, Tom and the team gently lifted Rex, supporting his frail body as they began to carry him away from Michael's grave. It wasn't easy. Rex's body trembled with every step. He was weak, exhausted, and fading fast. But for the first time in weeks, he was moving away from the grave, away from the place where he had waited for Michael to return. When they reached the fire truck, the team carefully placed Rex on a thick blanket inside. They drove him back to the station, where Rex had spent countless hours with Michael. Inside the station, the familiar sights and smells seemed to comfort him. The firefighters had prepared a small space for him, complete with a soft bed, fresh food, and water. The place where Rex had spent most of his life was now ready to welcome him back. At first, Rex didn't move much. He lay still, his body weak, but his eyes remained open. They followed the firefighters as they moved around him. It was as if Rex understood. For the first time in weeks, his tail gave a weak wag. The firefighters were filled with quiet relief. But Rex wasn't out of danger yet. His body was still frail, and his spirit still seemed distant. Over the next few days, Rex grew weaker. His appetite was small, and he could barely muster the strength to stand. The firefighters continued to care for him, giving him food, water, and love. They took turns staying with him, making sure he was never alone. One morning, Walter arrived at the station earlier than usual. He found Rex curled up in his bed, his breathing shallow and slow. Rex opened his tired eyes when Walter approached, but he didn't move. Walter knelt beside him, gently stroking his fur. "You held on for him, didn't you?" he whispered. "You waited as long as you could." Rex blinked, his tail giving one final, faint wag before it stilled. Walter sat beside him, his heart heavy with the knowledge that the moment they had all feared was finally here. Rex let out a final breath, and with that, the loyal German shepherd was gone. The firefighters gathered around him in silence. No one spoke. They didn't need to. They had all known this moment was coming, but that didn't make it any easier. Rex had been part of their family, and now they had to say goodbye. Later that week, the fire station held a small ceremony for Rex. His ashes were placed beside Michael Dawson's memorial plaque, together where they belonged. The ceremony was simple, but the firefighters and the townspeople who gathered to honor Rex knew that his loyalty, love, and devotion had left an indelible mark on their hearts. In the quiet aftermath, Walter stood by the plaque, staring at the place where Rex had spent his final days. He had never believed in ghosts, but sometimes, when he visited the station late at night, he could still hear the faint thump of a tail against the floor. A reminder that love, real love, never fades. It waits. Lesson from the story. Rex's story is a powerful reminder of the depth of loyalty and love that animals, and particularly dogs, are capable of. It shows that loyalty is not bound by time or circumstances, and that true love is not something that ends with death. Rex waited, not because he had to, but because he loved Michael so deeply that even in death he refused to let go. His story teaches us that sometimes the greatest act of love is not holding on, but learning to let go when the time is right. It reminds us that love and loyalty are not one-sided. They are shared and reciprocated. Even in the face of overwhelming grief, Rex showed us that love can transcend even the deepest pain. Loyalty, love, and devotion are not just words. They are actions that stand the test of time. And sometimes the ones we think we are helping end up teaching us the most about life, love, and what it truly means to be there for someone, no matter what.